Tonight, we step into the curious, crusty, and quietly horrifying world of Victorian bakers. Men who rose before dawn, worked beside ovens hot enough to cremate a small mammal, and unknowingly poisoned their neighbors one sourdough at a time. So before you sink into your pillow, only like this video if you truly enjoy what I do here, and drop a comment telling me where you're listening from. I love seeing the time zones stack up while we travel back to the past together. It's 4 a.m. in Victorian London. The streets are quiet, except for the occasional horse that forgot it died 2 days ago. The smog hasn't quite thickened yet, but it's coming. You, however, are already awake. Not because you love mornings, not because you believe in hustle culture. No, you're a baker, and in this era, that means you rise before God does. You drag yourself off a straw mattress so stiff it could qualify as a punishment device. There's no coffee, no alarm clock, only the wet cough of your neighbor and that internal dread that today might be the day the oven wins. Your bakery is less a cozy pastry shop and more a subterranean furnace. Lighting the oven requires skill, courage, and fingers you're willing to sacrifice. Victorian ovens aren't gentle gas ranges, they're coal-fed brick beasts that roar like angry dragons. To judge the heat, you don't check a dial. You stick your arm in the flames and measure by the pitch of your own scream. Too little heat and the bread is a damp sponge. Too much, and congratulations, you've invented artisanal charcoal. Within an hour, the soot has settled in your lungs, the flour is in your hair and ears, and your clothes are soaked. Some bakers wrap wet rags around their necks for relief, others simply accept the moist suffering. There are no windows. Why would there be? Natural light might improve morale, and we can't have that. The only glow comes from the oven's orange mouth and a single oil lamp with the wattage of a dying firefly. And then comes the fun part, actually making the bread. Flour, water, yeast, salt. Easy, right? Except this is Victorian England, where ingredients are either unaffordable, adulterated, or both. Your flour is bulked out with chalk, bone dust, and the powdered dreams of orphans. To make it look respectably white, you or the miller before you add alum, a compound used for tanning leather and pickling corpses. It fluffs the dough and dazzles the customer while quietly dismantling their kidneys. Salt costs money, so some bakers cut it with plaster of Paris. Yeast, if you can't get the frothy byproduct of a brewery, you recycle old bread, boil it down, and hope the smell of regret doesn't linger. And as for water, well, the Thames has many flavors, none of them clean. You mix it all in a wooden trough that hasn't been washed since Henry VII and call the stray hairs rustic. Alum isn't exactly poison. It's worse. It's slow. Cramps, vomiting, long-term organ damage. Poorer families bought the cheapest loaves, which meant the highest alum content. Hunger doesn't care about chemistry, so they ate what was available and blamed the resulting agony on ghosts, bad humors, or the French. And if alum doesn't get you, arsenic might. Many millers stored sugar and flour beside vivid green dyes laced with arsenic, the kind used to make fashionable wallpaper or to brighten children's candies. One careless scoop and your morning loaf becomes a slow-acting chemical weapon. The infamous Bradford sweets disaster of 1858, where arsenic-laced candy killed dozens, wasn't an isolated fluke. It was the logical outcome of a food system where "don't get caught" was the only regulation. So you soldier on in this oven dungeon, 16 hours a day, breathing soot, kneading poison, and praying the bread rises, even if you don't. By the time the last loaf leaves your hands, the city above is cloaked in smoke, and your own lungs are powdered with a fine blend of flour and industrial revolution. The customers head home tearing into loaves that gleam a suspicious white, never guessing their dinner is seasoned with chalk, alum, and maybe a whisper of arsenic. You wipe the sweat from your eyes and bank the fire. Tomorrow, you'll do it all again. Because in Victorian London, bread isn't just daily, it's deadly.
It begins with a sweet treat, gone catastrophically wrong. In 1858, a Bradford candy maker accidentally swapped sugar for arsenic trioxide. 21 people died. Dozens more were violently sick. Authorities called it a tragic mistake. Modern experts call it deeply preventable, with the radical idea of labeling things. Now picture the customers biting into a loaf or bun that tastes faintly metallic. They think, a bit rustic today. Within hours, they're doubled over. Pale skin, hair falling out, vomiting, and bowel issues so grim that death starts to sound polite. If they were poor, no one batted an eye. Neighbors shrugged, probably overworked. Or maybe they looked a chimney sweep in the eyes. Bad luck, that. And the bakers? Half of them didn't know. They were too busy trying not to pass out from heat stroke or dodge the soot-covered delivery boy's kick. If arsenic crept in, it was filed under one of life's invisible hazards, alongside ghosts, bad humors, and spontaneous combustion. Regulations? Those were for the wealthy, the only people who could afford to sue. Now imagine stepping into your friendly neighborhood bakery. You expect a cheerful man in a neat apron and the warm scent of fresh bread. Erase that image. Set it on fire. Replace it with a shirtless man, sweat dripping into a wooden mixing trough, while he whistles through 3 missing teeth. Victorian hygiene standards were aspirational. Bakers worked half naked because the ovens turned their cellars into bread-scented saunas. That would be fine if not for the open cuts, skin rashes, and the general complexion of a chimney sweep with seasonal scurvy. Hairnets? A joke. Gloves? Not a chance. Shoes? Optional. One infected foot away from becoming tomorrow's secret ingredient. Flour stuck to their chests, dough clung to their arms. By the end of a 16-hour shift, bakers looked less like craftsmen and more like ghosts made of glue. And cleaning the bakery? Also optional. Many were cramped, damp, and alive with vermin. Rats, the size of small dogs, scampered across counters. Flies performed synchronized aerial routines over mixing bowls. Cockroaches had assigned corners. Waste disposal? Simple. Floor. Leftover dough? Floor. Expired ingredients? Mix them into the next batch. Waste not, want not. Flour sacks were buffets for moths and mice, which kindly left droppings and the occasional corpse. A protein boost, if you like. Health inspectors existed, eventually, but they were few, easily bribed or ignored. Bread was the working-class staple. As long as it didn't smell like death, people bought it. One inspector described a bakery where the dough trough doubled as the owner's dog's bed. Another found rats baked directly into loaves. These weren't rare horror stories, they were Tuesdays. And the rats weren't shy. To them, Victorian bakehouses were paradise. Warm corners, endless grain, and humans too exhausted to care. They learned the daily rhythms, darting out during early morning mixing, stealing bits of dough, even riding delivery carts like tiny furry escorts. Some rats grew bold enough to hop right into the trough, nibbling dough until they slipped into the oven and became part of the crunchy crust. Bakers often shrugged. One famously said, "At least they take the weevils with them." A loaf returned with a rat's tail baked inside was met with, "Takes all sorts to make a meal." Customers rarely complained. Hunger outshouts horror. But rodents weren't the only hidden hazard. Victorian bakehouses were tinderboxes. Ovens were coal-fired brick monsters patched together with spare bricks and wishful thinking. They roared day and night. Bread waits for no man. Flour dust, meanwhile, is explosively flammable. One stray spark from a dropped coal or the baker's ever-present pipe, and kaboom! Entire bakeries went up like flour-dusted fireworks. Floors were wooden, soaked in oil and yeast. Walls were black with soot. Fire buckets? Maybe there was one. Maybe it held more flour. Some bakeries burned down multiple times and simply reopened with a shrug. One London shop caught fire 3 times in 6 years. The city council blamed bad luck. The baker blamed ghosts. No one blamed the giant oven wedged against a sack of coal and a dangling curtain. Insurance? Forget it. Most working-class bakers couldn't afford a policy. When the shop burned, they rebuilt with donations or just worked amid the charred beams. Customers called the bread wood-fired artisan and kept buying. And if you were a child with dreams of becoming a baker, congratulations. Welcome to indentured servitude wrapped in flour dust. Apprenticeships were sold to parents as golden opportunities. Learn a trade, earn a crust. Reality, you'd be shoved into a bakery at age 10, work 16-hour shifts for years, and graduate with scoliosis, flour lung, and an eternal grudge against yeast. Training meant doing every miserable task the master avoided, hauling 80-pound flour sacks up crooked stairs, stoking fires at 3 a.m., scrubbing soot while your lungs begged for mercy. Mistakes weren't learning moments, they were personal insults. Flatten a loaf? Expect a verbal lashing or a flying wooden paddle.
Settle in, friends. Tonight we climb the narrow wooden stairs of a 19th century bakehouse, up past the creaking rafters and into the life of the apprentice baker. Picture a boy of 12, maybe 13. His training begins with a week of verbal lashings. Burn a batch, sleep in the flour bin. Forget to polish the oven door? Are you trying to ruin me, boy? The living quarters were a joke. Most apprentices slept inside the bakery itself, usually in a cramped loft above the ovens. Imagine trying to fall asleep, wedged between sacks of barley and an elderly rat the lads have named Clarence. It was always hot, always noisy, and always smelled like yeast, smoke, and a pile of old socks no one ever planned to wash. Nutrition was ironic. Surrounded by bread, they lived on scraps. Full loaves were for paying customers. One former apprentice recalled that lunch was whatever the rats hadn't eaten yet. Inspiring, isn't it? Physical punishment wasn't rare, it was expected. A cuff on the head here, a boot to the backside there. If the master baker woke in a foul mood, you became the bread, pummeled, stretched and folded until your dignity collapsed like an underproved loaf. No parent intervened. The law looked the other way. Guilds existed mainly to defend the master's right to underpay you. And yet many apprentices stayed. What else waited for them? Coal mines, chimney sweeping, starving in the gutter. Compared to that, getting shouted at by a man in a flour-covered waistcoat at 4 in the morning almost sounded stable. Just don't ask about their emotional development. Step into that bakery and breathe. Go on, draw in a long, slow breath. Ah, yes, flour dust, coal smoke, and the subtle bouquet of permanent lung damage. In the 19th century, simply inhaling was a gamble. Bakers called it respiratory roulette. The prize? Chronic bronchitis, a condition politely nicknamed baker's lung, or, if you preferred a musical metaphor, the sound of your chest wheezing like a badly tuned accordion. Flour was the culprit.
Not the neat, sealed sacks of modern supermarkets, but raw industrial chaos. Mixing happened in open wooden troughs, by hand, in rooms so cloudy with dust you could lose a co-worker 3 feet away. Every stir, every sift, every sneeze sent up shimmering clouds of microscopic particles that settled deep inside your lungs and refused to leave. Doctors eventually gave it a name: baker's asthma. Symptoms: wheezing, shortness of breath, coughing until you felt you'd expelled an entire baguette. Some baking guilds considered a constant cough part of the uniform. And that was only half the poison. Those mighty ovens were coal-fired monsters. They pumped thick black smoke day and night, turning each bakehouse into a private smog chamber. Every breath mixed flour with soot, a cocktail of ash and gluten no body could process. So when you admire the perfect crust of an artisan loaf today, remember the boy who once slept beside a rat named Clarence, woke at midnight to knead dough, and breathed clouds of flour until his lungs played a sad, dusty tune. Sleep well, and if you dream of warm bread, maybe keep the windows open.
Close your eyes and step into a late-night Victorian bakehouse, somewhere between the rattling gas lamps and the smell of endless coal smoke. The air is warm, damp, and faintly sweet, until you try to breathe. Ventilation was considered optional. If you dared crack a window, you'd find it painted shut or patrolled by the local rat union, who charged steep rent in crumbs. And the mold, oh, the mold! Stale bread and damp flour sacks created a fungal utopia. Breathing in spores was simply another occupational hazard, right alongside burnt eyebrows or the occasional mild hallucination from the alum that bakers slipped into the dough. Masks? Forget it. In Victorian England, masks were for criminals, surgeons or actors in questionable theatre. Protection, if you were fancy, meant a scarf pulled half-heartedly over your mouth. Mostly you just sucked it up, literally, and hoped your lungs might evolve into something bread-proof. When a baker finally keeled over from respiratory failure, the obituary often read like a bad pun. Taken too soon, he rose daily like his loaves, until he did not. Neighbors nodded sadly and went back to coughing flour onto the buns. Bread wasn't merely food in Victorian England. It was sustenance, security, and on a good day, a blunt force weapon. Fresh from the oven, it nourished the body. 48 hours later, it could chip a tooth. By the third day, your humble dinner roll might crack a window. By the fourth, it was legally considered a medieval weapon in 3 counties. Bakers weren't known for preservatives or moisture control. They were known for turning yeast and water into bricks with handles. This created a strange social reality. Bread fed you, but it could also defend your home better than a constable. Want to discourage thieves? Display a week-old loaf in the window. Its aggressive density sent a clear message. Quarreling with a neighbor? A strategically lobbed crust settled the argument faster than words. Children, half feral and always inventive, turned stale rolls into missiles. Street markets became spontaneous battlegrounds, with cries of "Who threw the crumpet?" echoing down alleyways while someone nursed a rising lump on the forehead. Even the army took notice. Soldiers were never officially issued baguettes, but military rations included hardtack, a biscuit so dense it doubled as a tent peg. Men carved it into dice, filed it into tools, and occasionally hurled it across camp when boredom struck. One officer famously lost a duel with his ration biscuit. The biscuit won. And then there were the bread riots. When prices spiked or loaves mysteriously shrank, hungry mobs skipped polite petitions and hurled bread back at the bakers, sometimes flaming, sometimes studded with nails. Nothing says lower your prices than being pelted with your own product.
To the average passerby, the village baker looked harmless, apron dusted with flour, cheeks ruddy from the oven, smile as warm as a fresh bun. But behind that soft crust lurked a dangerous secret. He might have been poisoning the entire neighborhood. Not on purpose, probably. Bread was the backbone of Victorian meals, the edible plate, the one thing poor families could rely on to keep hunger just barely at bay. But almost no one knew what was actually in it, least of all the people eating it, and sometimes not even the bakers themselves. With almost no regulation, baking became a cheerful chemistry experiment. Want your loaf to look whiter, and therefore more expensive? Add a dash of alum or a sprinkle of chalk. Needed to stay moist longer? Try plaster of Paris. Flour running low? Bulk it with sawdust, mashed potato, or anything vaguely edible lying around. Arsenic sometimes made an accidental cameo. Customers eventually noticed. Children doubled over with stomach cramps. Elderly neighbors collapsed mid-toast. Dogs, creatures known to gnaw on leather boots, refused leftover crusts, which in any century is a serious red flag. When the rare health inspector finally arrived, he scraped samples from the loaves and confirmed what the dogs already knew. Victorian bread often contained enough poisonous metals to qualify as low-grade ammunition. So if you ever romanticize the scent of a quaint old bakery, remember this. Behind that warm, yeasty glow were lungs lined with flour dust, windows sealed by rats, and loaves capable of cracking skulls, or quietly poisoning you over tea. Sleep well, and if you dream of bread tonight, maybe keep it fresh and keep it soft.